On today's episode of Africa Uncovered, I'm joined by one of South Africa's best-known public historians, Dr. Dean Allen. A passionate writer, speaker, and storyteller, Dean has spent the past decade exploring the intersections of cultural history, sport, and society, both on the page and on the stage. His award-nominated book, Empire, War and Cricket, has sold over 20,000 copies in South Africa and has cemented his place as a leading voice on the country's colonial past. He's also the author of This Day in History and Frontierland, Volumes 1, 2, and the newly released Volume 3, a rich series uncovering forgotten tales from Southern Africa's frontier past. But Dean doesn't just write history, he brings it to life. He's a sought-after speaker, regularly delivering sold-out talks across South Africa and beyond. His audiences have ranged from cruise ship guests to war veterans in the Middle East, and he's become known for his ability to make the past both accessible and unforgettable. Dean is also the host of the podcast Frontierland, where he shares stories that illuminate the past in deeply human ways. And for those wanting to dive deeper into the evolution of sport, his new online course, History with Dean, explores how sport has become one of the world's most powerful social and economic forces. Join us as we talk about forgotten histories, the power of storytelling, and what it means to make the past matter today. Dr. Dean Allen, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I think it's going to really have some fascinating insights for us, and I hope it takes us on a journey that opens our minds and changes perhaps our perception of what history can do for us as South Africans. Right, so to kick things off, Dean, could you tell us a little bit about your journey as someone who was born in England and currently lives in South Africa, and as someone who has come from academia to public storytelling? Could you tell us what drew you to South Africa in the first place?
Sure. Well, it's a long story. We're going to have to go right back to the mid-1990s. I was living, as you said, in the West Country of England. That's where I was brought up. And I to academia late, and it was a fortuitous meeting, would you believe, at a gym. I was working at a boring office job. I'd left school at the age of 17, 18 with rather average A levels. Didn't know what to do with my life, and I worked in a couple of office jobs, and I got to my mid-20s. And I started to think, well, there's more to life than this. And I remember it was November 1995, and I went to the local gym, and I struck up a conversation with an attractive lady who happened to be an Afrikaner, would you believe? She was a dentist working for the NHS, working in my hometown of Taunton. And I was just amazed. I mean, not only by the accent, but what was this lady doing here? And she happened to be the same age as me, which was inspirational. The fact that this lady had got these qualifications, had been traveling around the world. Anyway, we got to know each other, and eventually she invited me to visit Cape Town, her home, in the northern suburbs of Cape Town, Velkomud, if anybody knows that area. So it's very Afrikaans. And I just fell in love not only with the place, who couldn't fail to fall in love with Cape Town, but I fell in love with South Africa and the people. And I realized at that time that there was a big world out there. And then she said to me, why don't you go back to university? Stop moaning about your life and your job. And with her support and the eventual support of my family, I signed up to be a physical education teacher at university at the age of, I think I was 26, 27 at the time. But that just opened up my eyes to, the world of learning. And I decided I didn't want to be a PE teacher, sports teacher. I wanted to, be a lecturer at university. So that's how I started on this journey. I finished my degree. I did well. For the first time in my life, I came top of the class. I'd never got an A at school, but now I suddenly applied myself. And I went on to do a master's degree and a PhD at Stellenbosch University. And South Africa for me was my place and continues to be my place. Despite this accent, I feel more South African than I do British now. But I realized, given the time, the mid-90s, it was a place that was opening up and there were lots of stories to be told. So that was going to be my journey. So yes, it was a fortuitous meeting, would you believe, at a gym. So that's a good example of exercise being very good for you, isn't it?
Definitely. I think it's an encouragement to everyone listening that you never know what might happen once you step inside the gym. So, so if you're thinking about not going this evening, then maybe change your perspective on that. Anyway, thank you so much, Dean. I think that's just incredible that a gym session essentially changed your life. Am I right? I mean, it just changed your whole perspective in the world in a sense. Can you tell me a bit where you came from originally? When you say you were unhappy with your job, what were you doing initially?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, yeah, it's as you said, but it's who you meet in life. And most definitely that meeting not only introduced me to South Africa, but it changed it changed the, future really. The fact we're talking today, I mean, we're years on now. It seems like yesterday, but it was several decades ago that happened. But yeah, I grew up in a small village in the West Country of England, quite sheltered really. Went to the local school. I got a job initially in the bank, which is incredible because someone who struggled at maths and certainly didn't have much financial acumen, should I say. I mean, the bank was not exactly the ideal place, but it was a good, solid job. Again, my horizons were very limited. I didn't was out there, and I then moved on to work for the National Health Service. We ended up sort of paying doctors, and I ran sort of financial programs. Again, completely different from what I do now. But it was a case of broadening my horizons, and that's what South Africa did. I think arriving into a place where not only the landscape was different, but also the people were different. I think the mid 90s in South Africa, people will remember, was a really special time. It was a challenging time, but given the fact that we just gone through, the whole democracy, and there was big changes, and there was a lot of trepidation with Mandela at the head. We had hope. I could just only see the positives. I think being outsider, I didn't understand. I was a little bit ignorant to the history of the country. I realized there was, a thing called apartheid, but I really didn't know what it entailed. And I sat, and I think one of my biggest is I sit and I listen to people, I absorb before I start, sort of giving my own opinion or writing. And certainly the history of the Afrikaner people and the relationship British, of course, in history, I didn't know any of that. I didn't know about the Anglo-Boer War, and I thought South Africa was a case of a division between, the black and white races. That was what I was brought up to believe. And of course, it's a far more complex and intricate situation, and continues to be so. But the hospitality of the people, the warmth of the people, and the fact, Kate, for the first time in my life as a British young man, we live on an island now, nearly 70 million people, where the British tend to struggle for space to be heard, in fact. So they'll tell you what they think most of the time. For the first time in my life, people wanted to hear my opinion, and I had enough respect for the country and for those people to make sure that I was informed if I did give an opinion. And it was an incredible privilege to be here. And when I ended up at Stellenbosch University, by the way, I went there for 6 months during my undergrad degree. I was at Cardiff University studying my undergrad degree. And the welcome that I got there in a principally, obviously, Afrikaans speaking environment as an Englishman, as they called me, and many worse things, may I add. It wasn't just an Englishman, but it was all good fun. And I know that they really did respect me and appreciate the fact I was there. And for me, it gave me the encouragement and the confidence to actually work hard. And that's what I started to look into South Africa's history, the British history, the colonial empire. We'll talk about those kind of things. But my first interest and love was sport, of course. So I looked at history through the lens of sport. So I looked at things like Afrikaner nationalism and rugby. I looked at sport during the Anglo-Boer War, and that's what led me, of course, to Mikey's Fontaine and the cricket story, but more of that later. But that was my journey. Really, I can say my greatest decade, my 30s, when I was old enough to study, but old enough to really, work hard, and knew when to relax, but also knew when to work. And I think that's lost on a lot of the students that I teach. At 18, they're highly intelligent, perhaps without the life experience. So as a they called us a mature student back then, but as a mature student, it was certainly a privilege to be in South Africa. By the way, the dentist, we didn't end up together. I'm sure people are wondering about that. I never saw her again since probably 2001, 2002, but that incredible lady certainly played a part in my life, and, led me on the path that we are here today.
Oh, so it's amazing how I think those moments can really shape our lives, and I suppose shape our futures. Someone might stay in lives for a short bit of time, but you don't know where it's going to take you. And I think that's the beauty of life, and perhaps something we don't necessarily learn in university. We have a set idea of where we're going, and I think students often today think they're doing law or medicine. That's, where they're definitely going to end up. But I think life can have a lot of twists and turns, as it sounds like in your case, and you can end up in the most interesting places that you never would have. I mean, did you ever picture yourself where you are now? Did you ever imagine that you would stay in South Africa and make a life career here?
Not at all. South Africa wasn't on my radar. I remember I played a lot of sport as a youngster, and I played quite decent level football. And I remember one of my teammates having South African connections. And when I mentioned South Africa, Table Mountain, and then he gave me a picture, and I was blown away. I didn't even know. And in a way, that was actually a benefit with no preconceived ideas. And I was literally a sponge. As I said, I came, I observed, I listened, I I was just encapsulated by the whole environment. How, I loved the sunshine, the beach lifestyle, and obviously the mountains and the outdoor life. But it was the people that really captured me. And the fact that there was this misconception that people were very divided here, and then of course we know the reality. There has been a very troubled history, but as I've made a career out you know the message that there are troubled histories in every nations, and it's not just South Africa. Sometimes we think we have a monopoly on that kind of past or background. um, but here, I'd never imagined not only South Africa, but going into academia, because as I said, I was part of the state school system in the United Kingdom. There were over 30, probably 35 in our. You kind of just got through school. You weren't you were encouraged to do well, but you weren't supported to excel. Only a few of us went on really to university out of our year group. But those that did very well despite that. We've never had a school reunion. It's just one of those things. It's you left school and you were certainly back in when I left. I mean, that's how old I am, to give the listeners some. I'm sure you've said I'm 53 now, but I left in the late 80s and it was the case of get a decent job locally. But as I say to my students, and as I often do at my motivational talks, life has different pathways for us, and we're not expected to make that decision at one time, certainly not at the age of 18 or 19, when sometimes you're not well equipped. So always be prepared to take a different path. Even in retirement, I see it now speaking on the cruise ships. I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But these wonderful people who are doing new things in their later years of life, and it just shows you life is a wonderful journey, and we need to be prepared to take different forks in the road. And I think that's a little thing about living in the United Kingdom. It's a little bit staid. People are too safe. They stay in their lane. They don't take those deviations that you see here in South Africa. In South Africa, we're survivors, we're hustlers. We have to make plans. We make different choices in our life throughout our life to get through life. But also, it's enriching, isn't it? You feel every day, and I'm so glad I did that. But I needed the encouragement of other people at that stage, because I didn't have this in myself. Because I'm the first person in my whole family to go to university. I mean, not just to go on and do what I've done, but to go to university. And I'm proud to say that some of my I would say nephews and the children of my cousins have now gone on to university and done well. And I think I broke a mold in terms of that. I know some families, it's the norm that everybody goes, but for me it was a definite career choice. Remember, it was a thing to do. I gave up a well-paid job at a time when wasn't anything guaranteed at the end of it. I just knew that I had to do something different. And as I said, she saw that in me and encouraged me to do it.
Sure. So I think from what I'm hearing from you, coming to South Africa, yes, it has a deeply troubled history and it has its issues now as we speak, but it really just gave you the freedom and an opportunity you might never have had back in England. And I think it's amazing and perhaps reminiscent of the colonial settlers who arrived here 18th and 19th centuries looking for a new future and a new hope and the freedom to shape their own lives in a sense. I don't know whether you would agree with that, but I think it's
100,
incredible to hear. Yes.
100%, Kate. In fact, I make As I was researching the book Empire, War and Cricket, the central character there is James Logan, a young Scotsman who arrived at the age of 19. Working class, he'd worked on the railways in Scotland since the age of 14, and he was actually on his way to Australia. And I'm sure we'll talk about Mikey's Fontaine a little bit more, but this clearly had the the talent, perhaps the charisma, certainly the ability to network. And he arrived in Cape Town at a time when the place was booming. He was as I said, he was on his way to Australia. So it was fortuitous, isn't it? He made his fortune here. And that's what created this incredible story about the man that brought cricket to South Africa and who built a Victorian town in the middle of nowhere. But he was at the age of 24 when he did all this. So how did he do it? Well, it was opportunity. He made the most of a time when, say, at the height of the British Empire, it was a frontier land. And I think if you look at any sort of colonization period or frontier land, I mean, whether it be the discovery of gold in in of America, for example, the Wild West, as they called it, there were individuals that really did well. There were many that didn't, of course. We tend to forget those that didn't. But I felt a little bit like James Logan when I arrived. I couldn't believe that this opportunity had not been taken advantage of by other people. For example, I mean, everybody's heard of Mikey's Fontaine, funny little place in the Karoo, but I was going to be the guy that wrote its story. Now, if as famous in the United States, Australia, or the United Kingdom, there would have been dozens of books written about it. There would have been films written about it. I mean, there was a song, there was a lot of folklore, but I was going to be the guy to write it. And the irony, not the irony, I would say the opportunity is never lost upon me, or the good fortune is never lost on me, because I realized I arrived, much like James Logan arrived in 1877, me arriving in, when was it, 1996, and then going on to start that story around the year 2000 was very similar, because the archives were opening up for people to see that. And going back to my passion for sport, I was fascinated by, certainly the Afrikaners' obsession with rugby. For me, that was a very British sport, and I wondered where this came from. And as I started digging, I mean, I couldn't believe that the first ever Springboks in 1906 contained players who had fought against each other in a war just 4 years before. And I thought, well, somebody must have written about this. There's a movie there. Seen the significance of that. Perhaps Nelson Mandela did later in 1995 when he put on the Springbok jersey. He realized the power of sport to bring people together. But all of a sudden I realized that these kind of stories had been overlooked because of apartheid, because of separation, because people had other things to worry about. But I arrived at a time of opportunity. So as many people are looking at the country as having no hope, I was surrounded by certainly people in the likes of Stellenbosch who were saying that they were going to put their kids on a plane. There was no hope for them in the future. And that alarmed me, because perhaps again I was ignorant to the past, but I only saw opportunity and a future for the country. The grass isn't always greener, that's for sure. And I've lived in the United Kingdom. I've travelled the United States extensively. I've worked in Ireland. I've lived in Australia and worked there. I promise you, the grass isn't greener. We have opportunity in this country despite all our problems. So yeah, it's got to a stage where I've tried the rest, and I think I'm in the place that suits me. Certainly for now. We'll never say forever because we don't know the future. Again, you've got to be open to change. But South Africa, it's spat me out a few times, but it takes me back because this is my place.
Wonderful. I think that's so encouraging, especially in the current circumstances. Perhaps many people here feel anxiety about the future and about, what it holds to them as South Africans. I think perhaps we can be encouraged by that it's not necessarily always easier on the other side, and one has to think carefully about these things, and I think again have a balanced view. But thank you, Dean. That's absolutely fascinating, and again, I just love hearing how you've become a South African at heart. So, Dean, I just want to talk a little bit about, I suppose, to connect two questions that I have, but talking a little bit about how you've reinvented yourself. So, over the years, over the last 20 years, you've of different skills, including anatomy and marketing. You've taught history. How did your career evolve over this kind of time? And then, relating to my second question, how did you end up writing cricket and researching the life of James Logan, who I think is definitely your kindred spirit, if I can put it that way. These two events sort of connect, and what the journey there, if that makes sense.
Well, no, it's been quite a journey. Going back to, I think we'll start with the second question, if I may.
Yes.
Empire War in cricket was again very fortuitous how I got it. I was looking for a PhD idea thesis, and when I was writing my masters at Stellenbosch, there was a big gap in again this idea of empire, how the British brought culture to South Africa, and they did so through something called cultural imperialism. They were very effective around the world, just they avoided going. They had to fight wars, of course, but they avoided force if they had to, but because they were very effective at spreading their religion, their language, their culture, their law, their education throughout the world. It's the reason why I often say they speak English in India, they play cricket in India, and of course the empire is still very reflective of that time. There was a gap in the history of South Africa in terms of this. I'd read about it in the West Indies, I'd read about it in Australia and India and other places, and I realized this was going to be my journey. So I'd written this master's thesis on sport during the war, the South African War, which was quite a convoluted way of writing about the war, which is exactly what I wanted to do because I was fascinated with that, but because I was always confined by being in sports departments. So I came across this place called Fontaine. Well, you must go. It was where the first cricket match was played, and by the way, that's I don't want to debunk that myth, but it is a myth. It wasn't played there, but it was pretty close. And I ended up going, discovering, thankfully, that James Logan, the creator of Mikey's Fontaine, was actually indicative of what was happening in South Africa in the late 1800s. When Cecil Rhodes was here, how they were cutting corners, they were at the frontier, they were making a lot of money, not all of it going back to the old country. And James Logan was one of his lieutenants, one of the people that operated at a certain level. And dare I say, how these men made their money, and they are men, I'm afraid to say, because it was the Victorian period. They all had strong women behind them, but it was very much a male world, which I do talk about in the book. They needed smoke screens for their activities, and James was going to not only build a model Victorian village as a homage to the empire that he tried to, or the British class system that he tried to escape, ironically, but he also was responsible for bringing the biggest sports team in the world, the English cricket team, down to South Africa on their second and third tours. So I realized this was very significant. It was a bigger picture. The war, roads, the politics, the whole thing needed to be discussed. And my big break came when I got hold of, quite fortuitously, I talk about it in Keynote, which I've probably told thousands of times now. I got hold of the family archives that had never been discovered before in a dusty old suitcase, James Logan's papers. So that allowed me to write at a level that had never been written before, and I wasn't going to rely on the folklore that was out there. I could actually write a PhD that was based upon primary evidence. People had written various things about him in his story. There was a contract controversy, for example. He made money out of the railways, and he sued the government. And there were various high-profile things, but this showed me that all these things were connected. Here was a man that operated during a certain time in history. It was prior to the Anglo-Boer War. That was certainly going to change everything for him, but he made the most of it. He brought down the rich and famous to this unlikely place in the Karoo. He bought his own newspaper. He controlled the media. He became a politician. Very much like charismatic, very much like some of the people in our, can we say, the leaders in the world today. And it doesn't take much imagination to realize who I'm referring to over the other side of the pond. But James Logan was for me someone that needed to be written about, not for him per se, but as an example of how the British Empire worked at the frontier. And when I defended my thesis, my PhD thesis, one of the professors said to me, "You've done something unique. You've actually shown the workings of the British Empire through an individual and a place, and it became very real." And of course, I always knew then that this was going to make a very good book. I didn't realize how many people were going to buy it, or how popular it was going to be, or how passionate I was going to become. But yeah, no, we turned it into a book after the PhD, and the rest, as they say, is history. To go back to your first question, well, my goodness, well, I've been on a bit of a journey. I actually finished writing the PhD about Logan and Mikey's Fontaine while I was teaching, would you believe, my first university job was in Northern Ireland, Belfast, the University of Ulster. Not only was it a fascinating place, a place that had been through and was actually still going through troubles in 2005, but I was teaching the British Empire to Catholics and Protestant students. Can you imagine how that taught me to be very diplomatic as a teacher, my first position? I spent a wonderful 3 years there, but I wanted the sunshine. I wanted to come back to South Africa, but I accepted a job in Australia. I ended up at a place called Deakin University, teaching in a business faculty. So there's my first experience of perhaps not teaching exactly what I was researching, but I was pragmatic enough to sort of teach, sport in a business way. I came back to England for a year at Northumbria University up in Newcastle, but it was the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa that brought me back. And I managed to sneak in the side door at Cape Peninsula University of Technology. They had one job going. It was to teach anatomy in their sports department. And I said, I can do it. I can do it. I just wanted to get back to South Africa as quick as possible and to be back here for the World Cup. And I ended up, as you said, teaching marketing, anatomy, anything other than sport or history. But I think you'll agree, and I know you're the same. If you're a teacher by heart, and if you can apply yourself to the material, you can teach anything. I had 5 years at Cape Tech, and then I went back to the UK to earn some decent money, like a South African would. I got a senior lecturer position at Bournemouth University in 2015. It broke my heart because I didn't want to leave South Africa, but I kept getting overlooked for they promised me for about 4 years running. I'm when it comes to the politics of South Africa and employment. So as a white foreign male, it was obvious that I needed to get a foot further my career. So I did, and I spent 3 years at Bournemouth. I improved my bank balance, but not my mental health, because I wasn't happy in England. I needed to be back in South Africa. And then I came back in 2019, and that's where my new journey began. And
Sure, wonderful.
I'll let you continue. I'll let you continue because the story in that, you must ask me about COVID and how that played out.
Well, I'd love to hear it. How did it play out?
Well, it was probably one of those life-changing moments. I found myself now out of academia. I'd left Bournemouth University, but in the back of my mind, I knew that it would be tough to get back to teaching in South Africa. And so we were going to settle in Spain. By now, I'd met my now wife in England, so that was a good reason to go back. My wife is Slovakian, and she loves South Africa more than me, I think, now. She's the biggest Springbok supporter in the world. I mean, a Slovakian Springbok supporter. You couldn't imagine it, can you? But we weren't going to come back to settle. We were going to live in Spain. I was going to get a job at a school, perhaps an international school. I just needed to live in the sunshine. England's weather got to me, and anyway, we came back to South Africa we were only going to stay 3 months. Well, COVID happened. 3 years later, we were still here. We were married with a baby. That's what COVID did to us. And I'd reinvented myself to what I am now, really, which is an author, a public speaker. The cruise ships would be on the horizon. That's a more recent addition to my repertoire, but I couldn't be happier. I step in and out of academia when I need to. I visit universities, I give talks, but I don't know I'd want to go back. I shouldn't say that if anybody's listening and wants to offer me a highly paid job, but I'm certainly happy in what I'm doing at the moment, being able to speak to you and do these kind of things, which really did change my life and perspective. Again, there's an example in my 50s, there was a massive change ahead for me, and I told myself, just go with it, and it out very well.
Sure. Quite an amazing story. And again, one of those moments, COVID, that just, I suppose, again, took you in an unexpected direction. But I think one that has definitely worked out for the best. So tell us a little bit about, Dean, what you're doing currently. So you run a podcast, you've written several books. Let's chat a bit about that. And I'd also love to hear more about Mikey's Fontaine. So maybe we should start with what your current role is, and then we can move on from there. So what are you up to currently?
Well, you're lucky to find me actually on dry land, because I think for the last 18 months or so, I've been predominantly on cruise ships. I had this wonderful opportunity about 2 years ago, speak on a cruise ship, Holland America. It was actually on a world voyage, and I stepped in as a last minute replacement as one of their speakers. They have these enrichment speakers on board, and I didn't realize what an important role they play, because while the ships are at sea, you get hundreds and hundreds of people wanting to be entertained, and certainly more than entertained, they want to be educated. So what a responsibility and what a privilege to be able to speak to these very successful people that can afford to be on a cruise ship. Some of them doctors, engineers, lawyers, all have had a very enriched life themselves. So to be able to talk to them and give talks. So I've designed a series of lectures that go down very well on the cruise ships, and I've been to some wonderful places over the last 2 years, including Japan, Alaska, obviously both sides of Africa, over to the United States. I even went through the Panama Canal, which was absolutely fascinating. But I talk about things that basically relating to Africa. I do give a keynote, would you believe, on Mikey's Fontaine in the British Empire. I talk about the scramble for Africa, which is also important in our history. But I also talk about some of the more emotive subjects, such as slavery, which is always also a difficult topic, perhaps. But I hope I do it in such a way that I'm sensitive to the issues, and it allows people to talk. And that's what I found on the ships, and certainly in the current climate. I think my role is actually to get people talking, because we do live in a divided society at the moment. I think that's what politics is doing for us, and no more so than the United States. Most of my audiences are American. So that's been an incredible privilege. And as I said, I'm looking forward to my next trip, which will be next month. And I go from Cape Town up to Barcelona. So what's not to love about that? But my day job, as I should say, is writing books. After the success of Empire War and Cricket, which has now sold over 30,000 copies, which is quite incredible. I myself. A lady called Jenny Chris Williams, I don't know if you know, she's the book lady on Talk Radio. She said to me, quite an intimidating lady, Jenny, she won't mind me saying, she said, Dean, if you sell 2,000 copies of that book, you've done very well. And I always remembered that. And so, yeah, Jenny's always astounded when and she says, wow, that book did so well. Because it's a great story, of course. Storytelling is the power of history. And then from that, during lockdown, the place we travelled lockdown, I was looking for a new Mikey's Fontaine, and I found it in the Eastern Cape at a place called Craddock. And the wonderful people in the Craddock, the Antrobus family, and I just must pay tribute to wonderful Sandra Antrobus. She's just passed away only last week, and my thoughts are with her and her family, because that lady did so much for that town, and they asked me to come along and tell the stories of the Eastern Cape, basically. And I did. It was a place that I fell in love with South Africa again. The Eastern Cape is a forgotten region, but it has so much. The frontier wars, of course, the wildlife, all the history, the Xhosa history. It's absolutely so rich. So I traveled around all these little forgotten towns and recorded some quirky stories, took pictures on my phone, and we turned them into a series of books called the Frontierland series. And now we've got 3 volumes of that book, and it did really well. We also, the other thing we're busy with, and my wife must take credit, is a in history newsletter that comes out every Monday. Please sign up; it's completely free, and we've created several books from that as well. We basically say what happened on this day in history, and it's the kind of thing that makes for good family conversations or quizzes and that kind of thing, and that did well. But I'm proud to say that not only has Frontierland Volume 3 just come out in the last weeks, but I've just released, I would say, my say serious book after Empire is a book called The Man Who Changed the Landscape, and it's the story of Adrian Gardner and his influence on wildlife tourism in the Eastern Cape. He was the man who built Shamwari Game Reserve, and he invited me, would you believe, out of the blue about 3 years ago to move to Port Elizabeth. I was kind of a bit reluctant, but what a move that was. I'm now back in Cape Town, but what a few had, because I've been writing about the history of wildlife conservation and land use in South Africa, and that's created a whole new opportunity. So that's hot off the press. Go and get your copy now, The Man Who Changed the Landscape. So yeah, quite busy at the moment, and currently writing my next one.
Amazing. So I think the key takeaway is keep going.
Going.
And never stop looking for stories. I'm interested here, Dean, when we talk about the Eastern Cape, when we talk about Adrian Gardner, when we talk about Frontierland, coming from all these different projects and topics, what are your favorite stories? Some stories that have really that have emerged out of your research, and what has jumped you, and what has stayed in your memory, or the back of your mind as being a key moment or a defining story?
Wow, that's a tough question, but a very good question. I think it comes down to people. For me, all of my writing involves strong characters or significant characters and people that have done something or made a difference. James Logan, for example. Frontierland, I tend to focus on people as well as the history of the town or buildings, but also the people that make it. Adrian Gardner's a great example. He's a businessman, an entrepreneur that turned his great passion and energy towards wildlife conservation and tourism. And it was his, and that's the one that book turned into more of a biography than a wider sweeping history. To go back to Frontierland, some of the people that I met, I've already mentioned the Antrobus family, Lisa and her mum Sandra. They were incredible. They've built that Craddock up and maintained its heritage and history around the Victoria Manor, around Market Street. So I must pay homage to them. I've got a wonderful friend called Charles Garth who absolutely adores Craddock and he will never leave. And when you meet these people who are advocates of their community and their town and their history, they you to help them do what they do, which is maintain a community, and that's what they do. Another great set of people that I met was in the era of Lady Grey, a retired headmaster from Lady Grey, the Oosthuizen family. They created in Sturksbrae, near Sturksbrae. I mean, heard of Sturksbrae, never mind visited there. They created a school in their retirement, which now supports the entire community and gives opportunity to a predominantly Xhosa community that would have nothing. And those are the kind of stories that inspired me. And I realized along the way that I am not writing the story. I am basically the messenger. I am the vessel for which to share these stories. And I think sometimes, certainly in academia, we take ourselves a little bit too seriously. We think that we're changing the world. You know, I always remember being at a conference with a friend of mine and he had great Irish wit and somebody was talking about a baseball series or something and he was so serious. My friend Dave nudged me and said, "You think this guy was talking about a cure for cancer, wouldn't you? I mean, come on, this is not stuff." But I think that academics sometimes lose, can we say, perspective because you're institutionalized. So what I've done now is recreated myself with that training, with that background, with that discipline of writing, with the understanding of what scholarly research should look like. But now I've given myself some freedom to report, I think, the most important stories in our society, which is what these incredible people are doing around our country. And that's what these last few books of mine have hopefully done and shown people that we do live in a country full of opportunity. And there are many, many people, despite all the that we tend to get, that believe in this country. And at the end of the day, as I say in my talks on the ship, we've got hope. If we haven't got hope, what have we got? And remember, as the American audience will often tell me, we've got enough problems in our own country. You're not alone. So South Africa, I think we're in a pretty decent space at the moment.
Oh, I think, Dean, from what I hear, you've managed to do something incredibly unique, and perhaps the goal of every historian is to bring the past and the present and the future together. And the way that you tell your stories and the way that you choose your stories, you've you've actually managed to achieve that, managed to draw these different threads together and somehow connect us to think the country in its if I can say its entirety, both its past and its sorry, I'm just busy. Can I talk to you guys just now? Sorry, Dean. Just my parents. Anyway, sorry, let me continue. So you've essentially managed to immerse your readers in through your podcast and through your books in their history and in our current circumstances and what the future could look like. And you've given us a sense of hope and I think a sense of identity as well as to who we were, where we come from, and who we could be. Am I right in saying that? I very much sense that this is the case, and I think it's an extraordinary thing to have done.
Well, you're totally correct, of course. And what is the value of history? It's to not only give us an indication of the past, but it's certainly to give us an indication of where we are to now, and more importantly, what could perhaps happen in the future. And that is where I get my power from, I think, in terms of and the strength to tell these stories. I always try to have relevance to the stories that I tell. To the audience, I think as a teacher, you must do that. You must give them examples that they relate to but show the relevance of this story. So, for example, even in something like the story of slavery, how the scramble for Africa. These were great examples of divide and rule being in place, and we're seeing that today in today's politics. And you've got to be very careful and very subtle how you pass that message on, because people are very sensitive to being preached to or told. So I tend to let them, let the penny drop itself. And certainly in my writings, you can, I even if I go back about Mikey Fontaine, James Logan, my criticism of the British Empire, there is also there is also to make up their own mind, because there are positives in stories, but there are challenges. So I tend to try to be a realist in what I do. I think you can be too idealistic, but I always hope that come away from either reading my books or certainly from listening to me speak, and there's a sense of energy, positivity, and learning from what we say. And as you said, at whatever level you share history, I think yes, it should be a story. Yes, it should be engaging. People should relate to it. Certainly should inform of where we are today. The great, one cliches was, "I wasn't there, so I don't care." In other words, that children can't see the relevance, young people can't see the relevance of history, but if it's taught in a certain way, it can certainly. And as I often say, my first line in any new term is, we need, the past is what happened. It could be what happened last night. It could be what happened this morning, an hour ago. You don't have to go years. You don't have this. So it's a case of finding what people can relate to from the past and bring it forward. Because as I can say, you don't have to be educated or informed to realize that there are certain threats to perhaps our safety, security, political stability that are happening even today that we can learn from the past. And yeah, you've rightly said my strength, and I think that's my purpose. And the most liberating thing, people get it. They come up after a talk, certainly on the cruise ships and at my corporate talks, and they go, wow, I can see that now. And it wasn't clear to me at the start. And some of this evolves almost as I'm speaking, because I realize that these examples are now repeating themselves again and again in today's world.
Aren't they just? But again, as you said, I think if one looks back in the past, it gives you a sense of, oh, what's the word? Not peace or calm, but a sense of these things have happened in the past. These events have made, sometimes life can feel shaky and uncertain, but we have, as human beings, as South Africans, we have weathered through a lot of storms, and we're capable as a nation, as a people, of handling more, I think. And I don't know if
Totally. If
that's
I
the
can
same attitude that you have.
Totally, Kate, if I can just jump in, a great example of that was during COVID. I was as uneasy and insecure and unsettled as everybody else. But I found myself in a position where I had a voice, and I thought, well, how can I do something here? And I started to develop a series of talks on the comparison with the Spanish flu of 1918. And not to say, two wrongs make a right, or it was to give us too much comfort, but the point was, look, guys, we've been through far worse in the past. The Spanish flu was the greatest natural disaster human beings have ever experienced in their history. And so COVID, in comparison, was, yes, a major challenge, but look at the past. We got through things like that. And the people in 1918, absolutely incredible. If you survived the Great War, the greatest war the world had ever seen, you now had this challenge of the Spanish flu. And so what I did, I developed a talk, and it captured the imagination, because I wasn't speaking in scientific terms. I was looking in terms of comparison with history and trends, and they were talking about the waves and how many times this would return. Next thing I know, I was being interviewed on TV. I was getting interviewed in places like Pakistan, Singapore, all around the world, because I think people were looking for guidance, assurance, and that's what history, I think, should do. It should give us assurance that these things have happened before. Let's not forget. And good and bad, if we repeat them, more than likely they will happen again in the future. And so I think COVID was a good example of how I used the past to give us that, comfort is the wrong word, but to give us a little bit of a sense of hope that we would get through this. Because at the time, as we know, it was pretty worrying and desperate. We were all isolated. But as I said, I was looking for things in the past. I did a talk on the big pandemics that mankind had been through. I mean, you can go back to the plague and all those awful things. I mean, it was really a lot worse in the olden days. So sometimes history gives us a bit of comfort that we are we are in a better place today. And I often say that in my talks, be careful what you wish for. We are in a decent place today in terms of technology, communication, compassion, when we show it to each other, that is. And I think that's the way history should be used.
Sure, totally agree. I think it has so many uses, and I think we underrate and underestimate the power of history to really. I think the key word that you would use, Dean, is critical thinking, to develop critical thinking, to open our minds and allow us to think perhaps not in a box, but outside of that box. Um, and to give us an ability to navigate life perhaps in a more dynamic and innovative way. And I think that that's the beauty and the power of history. Now, Dean, I just want to talk a little bit about going back to your passion for sport and your origins as looking into the history of sport. You've recently launched an online course on sporting history. Tell us a little bit more about that and how you see sport as a way to explore society and identity, and perhaps how it can unify South Africans, how it has in the past and how it can do it now. Yes, that's a complicated question, but we love complicated questions on this show,
No,
so I hope you don't mind.
no, not at all. It's a question I answer quite often. I mean, sport, like a lot of cultural aspects of life, they have people that like it and those that perhaps don't. But often when I give a talk, I can see sometimes that maybe the numbers are down and people are not necessarily sure. But by the end of the talk, they realize the importance of it. Because like anything, like language, like art, like religion, it's a cultural facet of how we express ourselves. Now in South Africa, it's a sports mad nation. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with the place. It was something I had in common. You play British sports, whether you like it or not. I'm afraid you do. You end up beating Britain at their own sports, but certainly it was the British that introduced sport here, and the rugby, cricket, and soccer, and all those kind of anglicised games. There's a lot of traditional folk sports already here, but we tend to overlook its power. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar pound industry. There's no question about that. Look at the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics. So in terms of business, it's important. But in terms of society, it's one of the few things that nationalize a nation. Look at us with all our official languages. It's the one thing we've got in common. Look at when the Springboks were so successful again. We all got together. It's the unifier. The politicians know it around the world, not just here in South Africa. There's always a minister of sport. It's so important. And not only that, sport mirrors society. Sport, if you think about it, if you have a very capitalist commercial society, sport tends to be a place where you can make big money. Back in the Victorian times, they believed that you shouldn't be paid to play sport. It should be pure and, bereft from the money aspect, which of course was a hypocrisy, as I tell in my book, because people always made money from it. But also the laws and the regulations. There was this idea that it taught you how to behave and how, a sort of a moral code. Think about fair play, respecting the referee's decision, teamwork. These are all critical things in learning, and sport is used in our upbringing at school. Whether you liked your physical education lessons or not, it was an important part of teaching you how to behave as a person. But I just get back to your point of critical thinking. I know we discussed this, and it is my absolute passion when it comes to modern day teaching. We live in a world of AI. We live in a world of information can be found on the internet, so-called fake news, etc., etc. The way we can combat this is to accept that there are these forms of information out there, not be negative about them, but to think critically about how we form our own thoughts, how we think about the world, and more importantly, realize there is always another point of view. So, regardless of your politics, regardless of what you think, listen to the other point of view. Perhaps watch that news channel that is biased in the other way, and realize that there are different ways of thinking. And critical thinking is such an skill that I think certainly should be taught on day one in every university, if not before, so that students and scholars and people realize that they get their information from different ways, and information always goes through some kind of lens. I mean, even what I'm saying to you now, it's my thoughts. It's not what I'm saying is not necessarily right. And I think I said to you, one of the interesting exercises I did at Bournemouth University, I taught a really boring course called Research Skills. But thankfully, it was a group of first years, so they're all fresh and keen. And I decided to introduce thinking as part of this. So I would give them my own articles, and I get them to be critical or critique my work. So in other words, I get them to try and break it down. And that was to give confidence to do so, because my work was okay, it was good, it had been published, but it wasn't necessarily 100% correct. And it was all information. Most of the information you get is biased. It comes from a certain framework. And the point of this exercise was to give them the skills to think critically about the information. Use the information by all means, but realize that it's gone through a certain lens or framework. I said white British class male, if you want to categorize me. So what gives me the right to talk about South African history in the 19th century? So that was something that I'm very keen on doing. And sport is one of those hooks that gets people interested. So my book, for example, Empire, War and Cricket, I can categorically say would not have sold so many copies if it didn't have the word cricket in the title. The point is, Kate, people need to identify with something. And sometimes it needs to be something a little bit, popular, and sport is popular. But the reality is, my book is anything but about cricket. Cricket was the game of the British Empire, but that was how I sold the book. That's how I got my interviews on British TV. That's how I did my talks, because of that. But the point is, sport is an important thing, but critical thinking, certainly, to go back to your point, I didn't want to not mention that. It's my passion, and that's part of how I present information. Of course, I've got a view and I've got my opinion, but I try to be as diplomatic with that opinion and try to give people their own right. I recently sat with a lady on the cruise ship. She clearly had different political views than me. But once I'd listened to her and sat to her and she was very rational, I could understand how she had those beliefs. And that helped my understanding of the overall situation. And not enough of us do that. Sit with the people who have a different view to you. But again, it's divide and rule. I believe we've got to sit together. We've got to talk again, because what's happening at the moment, people are not talking. And I can see that everywhere.
And once I think we allow that divide to take root, there's it it really stops us from progressing as a society, I would think, if you allow those divisions to become the core of who you are, and you allow your politics to take over completely without being willing to listen. It really is a barrier to, well, what would you say? What does it stop? What are the negative consequences of this attitude of not listening, of being so ensconced in one's echo chamber, one's own opinion, that you don't break out of that? What would you say is the the the, the disadvantage of that?
Well, the ultimate outcome of this would be conflict. I think we all realize, I don't think you need to be a historian to see that war does generally doesn't lead to anything positive. We can go back to the Second World War and what was happening in Europe, etc. And I think sometimes, war is inevitable. But again, there's an example of people not talking, being divided. For me, we've lost the middle ground. People tend to be, if you look at a political spectrum, they either be far left or far right. And I've seen it myself with very civil, educated people in their later years who shouldn't have this kind of anxiety. They can't even talk to each other because they are being, and I'm going to use the analogy, they're being played like puppets by people in power. They're being manipulated, because we tend to look, again, it comes back to critical thinking. We tend to turn on the TV channel that says what we want to hear. If both sides are being fed a certain narrative, they're never going to come together in the middle. Human beings are quite simple creatures. We like to belong. We like to be part of some kind of group. There's also always going to be a hierarchy, I believe. So this idea that we're all equal is wonderful in theory, but in practice, it doesn't happen. But the one thing we have in common, we do want to live in peace. We want to live with our families. We want to be comfortable. We want to have the basic things around us. And that is something that we've got to remember, because, as I said, like sat with, and that's the beauty of travel. the beauty of being an international citizen, as I call myself. I mean, we've referred to me as being British or South African, but I actually see myself as being an international citizen. I've sat with Russian people, I've sat with Chinese people, and they're incredible people. And you realize how much you've got in common and how little you've got actually that makes you different. But yet we are being divided in terms of not only our nations, but also our politics. The whole thing is becoming a little bit worrying, and I think this middle ground is what we need to find again, and the sooner it happens the better. And I think hopefully the next generation will see that. I think young people come into this with less of an agenda, and I think that they break down those barriers. But for me, it's important if I can do my little bit, even by standing on a stage, by writing a book, by giving that message, it's positive. Excuse me, I'm just going to get the door.
Yes, fair enough. No worries. I'll pause for a second. Oh my goodness. Alrighty, so my final question to you is, what's next on your journey? And again, I think it's fascinating listening to your philosophy on history and how it can actually pave the way, and how storytelling can pave the way to, I would say, a more secure or a more hopeful future. Absolutely fascinating, and thank you for unpacking that for us. So, what next on your journey? You spoke about a book earlier, and I assume you're jumping on a cruise ship again at some point. So, what's next on the agenda?
Well, no, what is next? No, it's been a wonderful few years, that's for sure. And yeah, no, I'm looking forward to the next, set of crossroads in my life. Really, I think happy at the moment doing what I'm doing. I think I've found quite a nice balance, but writing will always underpin what I do. I think books are very powerful. With the introduction of AI and new technology, perhaps I may be even the last generation of the traditional authors, as I say, but I hope that people will still contribute creatively to the process, certainly in history. And that comes back to, again, what we were talking about, critical thinking and knowing what is genuine and what we can use. And I'm currently writing a different kind of book. I'm putting together a history of the wonderful endurance event. I was invited to write the history of the Port Elizabeth to East London Surf Ski Marathon. It's a challenge that has been going for 50 years, would you believe? It goes over 4 days. And these crazy guys and ladies get in their surf ski, and literally every day they travel miles in the open ocean with sharks and whales and waves and everything against them. They complete this incredible challenge, and it used to be very well known, not so much now, but the committee have got together, and I think having seen me write the book about wildlife tourism, they invited me to write this. It's a little bit different because I've got a few cooks in the kitchen on this one. I've got a committee of guys who all want their story to be told, so I'm having to be very diplomatic, and I'm having to sort of balance the needs of them, and creating a book that's going to be worthy of the subject. But that's interesting, so that should be out later this year. We've got some wonderful pictures and some records there, and then let's see what happens next. I also do some tour guiding. A few people on the cruise ship, especially the a little bit naive and first timers to Africa, want someone to hold their hand. So I do that. I take them to the safari areas of the Eastern Cape and the Kruger and show them around the Cape. So that's a nice sideline as well. As you can tell, Kate, I just love people. I love sharing the stories and the experience of this wonderful country we live in. And I must just say to the listeners as well, and I'm not making this up, I've been on several cruise ships where they've gone around the world, literally on world voyages. They're on these cruise ships for about 4 months. I mean, can you imagine that? What a wonderful life. And without fail, the people come up to me and say South Africa is the highlight of their entire trip, whether it's the mountains, whether it's the beaches, but especially our wildlife. So I think we've got to embrace what we have in this country. I think we're in a quite unusually for us, we're in a quite good space in terms of well, I'm going to say world politics, but in terms of where we are compared to other countries. I think we have turned a corner in terms of our democracy. People are now holding our government accountable. That is something that had to happen. So I have a lot more hope for the future than perhaps I had 5 or 6 years ago, where we kept again repeating the same mistakes that we'd done before. And I hope one day South Africa is. We can have a society, a community that is not so much based upon the color of your skin. I think that is important. I think we much going for us, and we have a spirit of Ubuntu that goes throughout all of our country, where people just want to live in harmony and do the best for themselves and their family. And I think sometimes we've been again allowed ourselves to be divided, but people realise that now. I think you can see that we that in the last elections. I think we're now heading towards what I would say a true democracy should be, where people can vote for their own future. So I've got hope. So for myself and my family, I've got a 3-year-old who's growing every day. She's the light, of my eye. So me and my wife have got our hands full with her, but I then had a baby at 50, so that was probably the biggest in my life anyway. But I would not change that for the world. It's been an absolute privilege, and all parents do that. I want to grow up in a world that's a little less stable than it perhaps is at the moment in terms of people's insecurity and fears. And I think if we have the biggest perspective and realize the processes that are happening, and that perhaps we are a little bit controlled by media and politics and stuff, and we do start talking and get together, then everything will be okay. So yeah, I've got hope for the future. I'm looking forward to the next decade of my life and see what it brings.
Thank you, Dean. Wonderful. And I think, again, so encouraging, and definitely a reason to have optimistic outlook for the future. Last question, Dean. If our listeners are interested, where can they find your books or more about you? So, sorry, let me start that again. If our listeners are interested in finding out more about you, or your books or your podcast, or just general information on what you do, where can they go?
Oh, thank you, Kate. Well, I'm sure some people have already followed me, but I'm all over social media. It's one of those things I had to engage with. I've got, would you believe, 130 odd thousand listeners, followers, should I say, on Facebook. So Facebook's a good place to start. Dr. Dean Allen, author, speaker, historian. That's my page. Also my website, which is deanallen.co.za. That's Allen with an E, not an A. And also you can find details of my Frontierland podcast. I'm really proud of that. I interviewed a lot of the significant people in the Eastern Cape and throughout South Africa as part of my journey. And the other thing, which is everyone likes something that's free, please sign up for our newsletter, which is This Week in History. You can do so at my website, right at the bottom. Subscribe to my newsletter, and every Monday it will drop into your inbox. You can read it, forward it, delete it, do whatever you want, but that's a nice way of staying in touch. So yeah, I look forward to hearing from anybody, and keep the discussions open. That's the most important thing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean, for joining us today.
Thank you, Kate. What a pleasure. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.